The autumn rain drummed against the tin roof of Murphy's County Tavern like bullets hitting metal, each drop echoing through the smoky interior, where the smell of stale beer and wet tobacco hung thick as morning fog. October 23rd, 1983 started like any other Saturday night in Beckley County, West Virginia, but it would end with blood on the tavern floor, and 9 men marked for a reckoning that would shake the mountain community to its core. Inside the dimly lit establishment, the McCoy brothers sat at their usual corner table, nursing beers that had long since gone warm. At first glance, you might mistake them for children until you notice the weathered hands wrapped around their bottles and the hard lines etched into faces that had seen 30-plus years of mountain life. Samuel McCoy, the eldest at 34, stood 4 feet 2 inches in his work boots, the same height that had defined his family's struggle since the day he was born. Beside him sat his brothers, Marcus, 31, with shoulders broad as a coal miner despite his diminutive stature; Jesse, 28, whose quick wit had talked them out of more fights than his fists had won; and the youngest, Thomas, barely 25, whose anger burned hot as the furnaces where he worked 12-hour shifts at the steel plant. Together, they represented 4 generations of McCoy blood that had carved out a living from these unforgiving mountains, and 4 lifetimes of proving that a man's worth wasn't measured in inches. The brothers had come to Murphy's for the same reason mountain folk had gathered in taverns for generations, to wash away the week's troubles with whiskey and find fellowship among people who understood what it meant to work with your hands and live by your word. They'd been coming here every Saturday for nearly a decade, earning respect through their work ethic, their loyalty to family, and their willingness to stand up for anyone who couldn't stand up for themselves. Samuel worked the night shift at Beckley Mining Company, crawling through tunnels that would break taller men's backs, his size an advantage in the narrow seams where coal waited to be pulled from the earth. Marcus ran a small auto repair shop that served 3 counties, his mechanical genius making up for what his stature might suggest to strangers. Jesse had built a reputation as one of the finest carpenters in the region, crafting furniture that would outlast the trees it came from. And Thomas, despite his youth, commanded respect at the steel plant where supervisors had learned that his work output matched that of any man twice his size. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the familiar comfort of Murphy's Tavern carried an undercurrent of tension that Samuel couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was the way the rain seemed angrier than usual, or how the other patrons glanced at their table with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed amusement. Or maybe it was the group of 9 strangers clustered around the bar, their voices growing louder with each round of drinks they ordered. The strangers had arrived around 8 o'clock, rolling up in 2 pickup trucks with Virginia license plates and attitudes that immediately marked them as outsiders. They wore the kind of clothes that suggested steady work: clean jeans, work boots that weren't scuffed by actual labor, and flannel shirts that looked store-bought rather than earned. Their leader, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and cold blue eyes, had introduced himself to Murphy as Danny Crawford, claiming they were passing through on their way to job interviews at a new construction site in the next county. But Samuel McCoy had lived in these mountains long enough to recognize predators when he saw them. These men moved with the casual arrogance of people who believed their physical size granted them authority over others. They'd been drinking steadily for 3 hours, and with each beer, their voices grew louder and their jokes cruder. They'd already made comments about the other patrons, mocking old Pete Morrison's limp, laughing at widow Sarah Jenkins when she struggled to reach something on a high shelf, and generally establishing themselves as the kind of men who found entertainment in others' misfortune. The McCoy brothers had endured their share of comments and stares throughout their lives. Growing up with dwarfism in a culture that prized physical strength and imposing presence had taught them patience, resilience, and the wisdom to choose their battles carefully. They'd learned to distinguish between genuine curiosity and malicious intent, between ignorant comments and deliberate cruelty. Most of the time, they could deflect unwanted attention with humor, redirect confrontation through conversation, or simply ignore behavior that wasn't worth the trouble it would cause. But as the evening wore on, Danny Crawford and his crew seemed determined to test every boundary of decent behavior. They'd started with whispered comments and sideways glances, then progressed to louder observations about the entertainment at their corner table. Samuel felt his jaw clench as Crawford's voice carried across the tavern, each word designed to humiliate and dehumanize. "Marcus," Samuel said quietly, not taking his eyes off the group at the bar. "We should probably head home soon." Marcus nodded, understanding the subtext in his brother's voice. At 31, he'd developed the same instincts that had kept their family out of serious trouble for years. Mountain justice was real and final, but it was also reserved for situations that couldn't be resolved through other means. A group of drunk strangers making crude comments didn't rise to the level of violence no matter how much their words stung. Jesse finished his beer and stood up, his movement deliberate and unhurried. "I'll settle up with Murphy," he said, his voice carrying the calm that came from years of diffusing tense situations through reasonable action. The brothers had learned early that maintaining dignity in the face of insult was often more powerful than responding with anger. But Thomas, the youngest and least experienced in controlling his temper, remained seated with his hands clenched into fists. At 25, he still burned with the righteous fury of someone who believed the world should be fair, that decent people should be treated with respect, and that sometimes a man had to fight to maintain his honor. The scars on his knuckles told the story of a young man who'd learned to use violence as a tool for demanding respect from people who wouldn't give it freely. "Tom," Samuel said softly, recognizing the dangerous gleam in his youngest brother's eyes, "let it go. These boys will be gone tomorrow, and we'll still be here." But Crawford's voice rose again, cutting through the tavern's ambient noise like a blade. "Hey, Murphy," he called to the bartender. "Do you serve children in here, or are those your trained circus performers?" The tavern fell silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Pool cues paused over felt tables, and every patron turned to see how this moment would resolve itself. Murphy's Tavern had served the mountain community for 40 years, and in all that time, it had operated according to unwritten rules that governed how people treated each other. Strangers could drink, strangers could laugh, strangers could even argue, but strangers didn't humiliate families who'd earned their place in the community through decades of hard work and honorable behavior. Samuel felt something cold settle in his chest as he recognized the moment when words crossed over into something that couldn't be ignored. Crawford wasn't just making crude comments anymore. He was deliberately challenging the McCoy brothers' right to exist in their own community, their right to drink in peace among people who knew their worth, their right to be treated as men rather than objects of entertainment. Crawford wasn't finished. Emboldened by his friend's laughter and the silence that had fallen over the tavern, he stood up from the bar and walked toward the McCoy brothers' table, with the swagger of someone who believed his 6-foot frame granted him automatic authority over anyone smaller. "I'm serious," Crawford continued, his voice carrying the mock concern that made his words even more insulting. "These little fellas shouldn't be drinking without adult supervision. Hell, I bet they need booster seats just to reach the table." His crew exploded in laughter, the kind of cruel amusement that fed on others' humiliation. The sound echoed through Murphy's Tavern like breaking glass, shattering the unspoken compact that had governed mountain hospitality for generations. These strangers weren't just insulting the McCoy brothers. They were violating the fundamental principle that community members protected each other from outside cruelty. Thomas McCoy stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound that seemed to announce the end of patience. At 25, he possessed the kind of physical strength that came from years of manual labor, despite his diminutive stature. His hands, scarred from steel plant work, had also been hardened by countless fights with people who'd made the mistake of underestimating what a determined man could accomplish when his honor was at stake. "Mister," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the particular calm that mountain people recognized as a warning, "you're drunk, and you're talking about things you don't understand. I'd suggest you sit back down and mind your own business." Crawford's grin widened as he looked down at Thomas, apparently delighted to have provoked a response. "Or what, little man? You gonna teach me a lesson? You and your whole toy army?" The insult hit the McCoy brothers like a physical blow. They'd endured crude comments, ignorant questions, and thoughtless remarks throughout their lives. But Crawford had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He wasn't just mocking their appearance. He was denying their humanity, reducing 4 grown men with families, jobs, and decades of community respect to objects of ridicule for his entertainment. Samuel McCoy rose from his chair with the deliberate movement of someone making a decision that couldn't be unmade. At 34, he'd learned to choose his battles carefully to distinguish between ignorance that could be educated and malice that had to be confronted. Crawford's behavior fell squarely into the second category. "Mr. Crawford," Samuel said, his voice carrying the authority that came from being the eldest son in a family that had defended itself for generations. "You've had your fun. Now you need to apologize to my brothers and leave this establishment." Crawford looked around the tavern, apparently expecting support from the other patrons, but found only faces that had turned cold as mountain winter. Murphy's customers might not always agree with each other, but they understood community loyalty, and strangers who attacked local families quickly learned that mountain hospitality had limits. Instead of backing down, Crawford seemed to interpret the silence as permission to escalate. "Apologize," he laughed, his voice carrying the particular cruelty that some people reserved for those they considered beneath them. "For what? Pointing out what everyone else is thinking? Hell, I bet you boys couldn't reach the urinal in the men's room without a stepladder." His crew erupted in fresh laughter, apparently oblivious to the fact that the temperature in Murphy's tavern had dropped to Arctic levels. The other patrons weren't laughing anymore. They were watching with the careful attention that mountain people paid to situations that might require intervention. Several men had shifted their positions slightly, moving closer to the confrontation while trying to appear casual. Murphy himself, a 60-year-old veteran who'd served in Vietnam and seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, stepped out from behind the bar with the measured movement of someone preparing to restore order to his establishment. But before he could speak, Crawford made his final mistake. "You know what?" Crawford said, apparently intoxicated by his own cruelty. "I bet all four of you boys together couldn't whip one real man. You're not men at all. You're just genetic accidents that should have been put out of their misery at birth." The words hit the tavern like a grenade. In the mountain culture that had shaped the McCoy brothers, a man's worth was measured by his work, his word, and his willingness to defend his family. Crawford hadn't just insulted their appearance, he'd attacked their fundamental right to exist, their legitimacy as human beings, and their standing as men who'd earned respect through decades of honorable behavior. Thomas McCoy moved first, his 25 years of accumulated rage finally finding a target worthy of release. He covered the distance between the table and Crawford in 3 quick steps, his fist connecting with the larger man's solar plexus with the kind of precision that came from years of fighting men who underestimated his capabilities. Crawford doubled over, gasping for breath that wouldn't come, his face turning the color of raw meat as he struggled to understand how someone half his size had just knocked the wind out of him so completely. His friends started forward, apparently intending to help their leader, but they stopped when they saw Marcus, Jesse, and Samuel McCoy rising from their table with the coordinated movement of men who'd fought together before. "Now you've got a choice," Samuel said to Crawford's crew, his voice carrying the calm that preceded mountain violence. "You can help your friend to his feet, walk out of here, and never come back. Or you can find out why smart people don't start fights with mountain families in their own territory." For a moment, it seemed like wisdom might prevail. Crawford was still struggling to breathe, bent over and clutching his chest while his 8 companions looked around the tavern and began to realize that they weren't just facing 4 small men. They were facing an entire community that had turned hostile, surrounded by patrons who'd moved into supporting positions and a bartender whose expression suggested he'd seen enough violence to end this confrontation permanently if necessary. But alcohol and arrogance proved stronger than common sense. One of Crawford's men, a thick-necked construction worker named Billy Hayes, apparently decided that his crew's reputation required them to respond with force rather than retreat with dignity. He grabbed a beer bottle from the nearest table and advanced on Thomas, who was still standing over Crawford's gasping form. "You little freak," Hayes snarled, raising the bottle above his head. "Nobody sucker punches our friend and gets away with it." Hayes's mistake was assuming that his size and weapon gave him an automatic advantage over someone he considered physically inferior. He'd never fought mountain people who'd learned to use their opponent's assumptions against them, who'd developed fighting techniques that turned size differences into tactical advantages, and who'd been raised to believe that survival sometimes required violence so swift and decisive that larger opponents never had time to use their physical advantages. Jesse McCoy intercepted Hayes before the bottle could descend, grabbing the man's wrist and using his forward momentum to send him crashing into a nearby table. The impact scattered beer bottles and knocked chairs across the floor, the sound of breaking glass punctuating the violence that was about to engulf Murphy's tavern. What happened next would be remembered by every witness for the rest of their lives. The McCoy brothers fought with the coordinated precision of men who'd learned to defend themselves against multiple opponents, using techniques that maximized their strengths while exploiting their enemies' weaknesses. They moved beneath their opponent's guard, struck at pressure points that could drop much larger men, and used their lower center of gravity to topple attackers who expected to fight standing opponents. Marcus caught one of Crawford's men with an uppercut that lifted the surprised attacker off his feet before depositing him unconscious on Murphy's floor. Samuel used a bar stool to even the odds against two opponents who'd tried to corner him near the pool table, wielding the improvised weapon with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to turn any object into a tool of survival. Thomas continued his assault on Crawford, his fists working like hammers against the larger man's ribs and stomach. The violence lasted less than 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes redefined everyone's understanding of what the McCoy brothers were capable of when pushed beyond their considerable patience. Crawford's crew had expected easy victims. Instead, they found themselves facing men who'd been forged by decades of proving themselves in a world that didn't accommodate their physical differences. When the dust settled, 9 men from Virginia lay scattered across Murphy's floor in various states of unconsciousness and injury. Crawford himself sat propped against the bar, his face bloody and his breathing labored, staring at Thomas McCoy with the stunned expression of someone whose fundamental assumptions about the world had just been violently corrected. The McCoy brothers stood in the center of the tavern, breathing hard but largely uninjured, their clothes torn and their knuckles bloodied, but their dignity intact. Around them, the other patrons began to emerge from their defensive positions, their faces showing the kind of satisfaction that mountain communities felt when justice was properly administered. Murphy surveyed the damage to his establishment with the philosophical acceptance of someone who'd seen worse. Broken chairs could be replaced, blood could be mopped up, and shattered glass could be swept away. But the principle that had been defended tonight, the right of community members to drink in peace without being humiliated by strangers, would be remembered long after the tavern was restored to order. "Samuel," Murphy said quietly, his voice carrying the respect that mountain people reserved for men who'd proven themselves under pressure. "You and your boys did what needed doing, but these fellows are going to wake up tomorrow with grudges and maybe ideas about getting even." Samuel McCoy looked down at Crawford, who was still conscious enough to understand what was being said. "Let them have their ideas," Samuel replied, his voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who'd just crossed a line he could never uncross. "But if they're smart, they'll head back to Virginia and never set foot in this county again." Crawford struggled to his feet, using the bar for support, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that might have been fear or might have been rage. It was impossible to tell which emotion would prove stronger when he had time to think about what had happened in Murphy's tavern. "This isn't over," Crawford gasped, blood running from his split lip. "You little freaks think you won something here, but all you did was make enemies you can't afford to have." Thomas stepped forward, apparently ready to continue the conversation with his fists, but Samuel caught his brother's arm. "It's over for tonight," Samuel said firmly. "These boys have learned what they came here to learn." But even as he spoke, Samuel McCoy understood that Crawford's threat wasn't empty bravado. The violence in Murphy's tavern had resolved the immediate confrontation, but it had also created something more dangerous, a conflict between men who'd been humiliated and men who'd defended their honor. In mountain culture, such conflicts rarely ended with a single fight. As Crawford's crew slowly regained consciousness and began helping each other toward the door, their faces showed the particular hatred that comes from being defeated by opponents you'd underestimated. They limped out of Murphy's tavern in silence, but their expressions promised that this confrontation was the beginning of something rather than the end. Samuel watched them go with the heavy feeling of someone who'd just lit a fuse without knowing how long it would burn before exploding. The McCoy brothers had defended themselves successfully, but they'd also made 9 enemies who knew where to find them and who had every reason to seek revenge. The tavern fell quiet except for the sound of broken glass being swept into dustpans and chairs being righted. The other patrons gradually returned to their conversations, but the atmosphere had changed. Everyone understood that something significant had happened, something that would have consequences extending far beyond a single night's violence. "Boys," Samuel said to his brothers as they prepared to leave, "I think we better start being extra careful for a while. Men like Crawford don't forget being humiliated, and they don't forgive being beaten by people they consider inferior. Thomas, still flushed with adrenaline from the fight, seemed almost eager for another confrontation. "Let them come," he said, his young voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd just proven himself in combat. "We showed them tonight what happens when you disrespect the McCoy family." But Samuel, with 4 years more experience in understanding how violence created cycles that could destroy families, felt less optimistic about their future. Crawford and his crew would have time to think about what had happened, time to plan their response, and time to recruit additional help for whatever revenge they might be considering. As the McCoy brothers walked out into the October rain, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that the night's violence had been the easy part. The real test of their family's strength would come when Crawford returned with reinforcements and a plan designed to restore his crew's damaged reputation through methods that might not be limited to fistfights in public places. The mountain darkness swallowed them as they walked toward their trucks, but Samuel knew that somewhere in that same darkness, 9 men were nursing their injuries and planning their revenge. The McCoy brothers had won their first battle, but they were about to discover that some victories came with prices that couldn't be calculated until the bill came due. The rain continued to fall as they drove home through winding mountain roads, washing the blood from Murphy's Tavern, but unable to wash away the consequences of what had been started there. By morning, word would spread through the mountain community that the McCoy brothers had stood up to outside bullies and won. But word would also spread to places where Crawford had connections, where size and numbers mattered more than justice, and where revenge was considered a legitimate response to being humiliated by men who were supposed to know their place. The stage was set for a conflict that would test everything the McCoy family believed about honor, survival, and the price of defending your dignity in a world that didn't always respect the rights of those who were different. The first blood had been spilled, but the real war was just beginning. The Virginia motel room reeked of stale cigarette smoke and cheap disinfectant, but Danny Crawford barely noticed the smell as he sat on the edge of the sagging bed, gingerly probing his swollen jaw with his fingertips. 3 days had passed since the humiliation at Murphy's Tavern, and the pain in his ribs served as a constant reminder of how 4 genetic accidents had made him and his crew look like amateurs in front of an entire mountain community. Across the room, Billy Hayes nursed a black eye that had turned spectacular shades of purple and yellow, while the other 7 members of Crawford's crew displayed their own collections of bruises, cuts, and wounded pride. They'd driven straight through the night after leaving Beckley County, stopping only when they'd put 50 miles of Virginia highway between themselves and the McCoy brothers' fists. The original plan had been simple: drive to West Virginia, check out potential construction opportunities, maybe have some fun with the local hillbillies, and return home with stories about how easy it was to intimidate mountain folk who didn't understand modern authority. Instead, they'd returned with injuries that would take weeks to heal and humiliation that might never fade. "I still can't believe those little freaks got the jump on us," muttered Steve Patterson, a stocky electrician whose nose was still packed with gauze from where Marcus McCoy had broken it with a single uppercut. 9 against 4, and they made us look like children. Crawford's silence had been brooding and dangerous for 3 days, punctuated only by occasional grunts of pain when movement aggravated his injuries. But the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of stillness that preceded violent storms. His crew had learned to recognize the signs over their 5 years of working together, and they understood that their leader was planning something that would either restore their reputation or get them all killed. Danny Crawford wasn't just another construction worker with a mean streak and a drinking problem. At 38, he'd built a reputation throughout southwestern Virginia as someone who solved problems that couldn't be handled through legal channels. Contractors who faced union troubles called Crawford. Property developers who encountered resistance from stubborn landowners hired his crew. And men who needed to send messages about respect and authority paid Crawford's rates without questioning his methods. His crew consisted of carefully chosen men who shared his philosophy that physical intimidation was often more effective than negotiation. Billy Hayes had done 2 stretches in state prison for assault and battery, emerging each time with refined techniques for inflicting maximum pain without causing permanent damage that might attract excessive police attention. Steve Patterson had been dishonorably discharged from the Army for incidents involving civilian populations that the military preferred not to discuss publicly. The rest of Crawford's team represented similar combinations of useful skills and questionable moral standards. They were men who understood that some problems required violence, who possessed the tools and temperament necessary for intimidation work, and who followed Crawford's leadership because it provided them with steady income and periodic opportunities to exercise their particular talents. But the McCoy brothers had shattered Crawford's crew's fundamental assumptions about how intimidation worked. They'd expected to face mountain men who would back down when confronted by superior numbers and aggressive posturing. Instead, they'd encountered opponents who fought with the kind of desperate skill that came from a lifetime of proving themselves against people who underestimated their capabilities. Danny, Hayes said carefully, understanding that his leader's mood had reached dangerous levels. Maybe we should just chalk this up to bad luck and move on. Those boys caught us by surprise, but now they know we're out here. Next time won't be so easy. Crawford's response came in a voice so quiet that his crew had to strain to hear it. Next time, he said, his words carrying the particular calm that preceded Crawford's most violent decisions. Those genetic freaks are going to learn what happens when you embarrass the wrong people. The motel room fell silent as Crawford's crew absorbed the implications of his statement. They'd worked with him long enough to understand that he never made idle threats, never promised violence he wasn't prepared to deliver, and never forgot humiliation that demanded revenge. The McCoy brothers had won their fight, but they'd also marked themselves for a response that would be planned carefully, executed professionally, and designed to send a message throughout the mountain communities about the consequences of resisting outside authority. "What are you thinking?" asked Tommy Morrison, a thin man whose specialty was acquiring information about targets through methods that skirted the edges of legality. Morrison had connections throughout law enforcement, social services, and county government that allowed him to build detailed profiles of people who'd attracted Crawford's attention. Crawford stood up slowly, his movements deliberate despite the pain in his ribs. At 6 feet 2 inches and 220 pounds, he cut an imposing figure even when injured. His gray hair and cold blue eyes suggested someone who'd learned to use violence as a tool rather than an emotion, and his crew understood that their leader's planning process was about to begin. "I'm thinking," Crawford replied, walking to the motel window and staring out at the Virginia landscape, "that we need to know everything about Samuel, Marcus, Jesse, and Thomas McCoy. Where they live, where they work, who they care about, and what would hurt them most." Morrison nodded, already mentally reviewing his contacts in West Virginia government offices. "I can have complete files on all four brothers within 48 hours. Employment records, property ownership, family connections, criminal history if any exists." "Good," Crawford said, "but I want more than public records. I want to know their routines, their vulnerabilities, their pressure points. I want to know who they love and what they fear." Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his chair, recognizing the tone that indicated Crawford was planning something more elaborate than simple retaliation. "Danny, if we're talking about going after their families, that's a different kind of operation. Mountain folk take family business seriously, and if we cross that line, we might find ourselves dealing with more than just 4 angry brothers." Crawford turned from the window, his expression carrying the kind of cold calculation that had made him successful at intimidation work throughout southwestern Virginia. "Billy, those little freaks made us look like amateurs in front of an entire tavern full of witnesses. By now, word has spread through half the mountain communities in West Virginia about how 9 tough guys from Virginia got their asses handed to them by 4 genetic accidents." The truth of Crawford's statement settled over the room like smoke from a house fire. Reputation was everything in their line of work, and clients who hired intimidation specialists expected to be represented by men who could project unquestionable authority. The McCoy brothers had damaged that reputation in ways that might affect Crawford's crew's ability to earn a living. "Our options are simple," Crawford continued, his voice carrying the methodical tone he used when explaining tactical situations to his crew. "We can slink back to Virginia with our tails between our legs and hope nobody notices that 4 dwarfs made us look like children. Or we can return to West Virginia and remind everyone why smart people don't mess with Danny Crawford's operation." Patterson spoke up from his position near the bathroom door, his voice muffled by the gauze packing his broken nose. "What if we just call the sheriff? Those boys assaulted 9 men in a public establishment. It's got to be worth something in court." Crawford's laugh carried no humor whatsoever. "Steve, we started that fight by mocking disabled men in their own community. Any sheriff who investigates will find 9 outsiders who came to a local tavern looking for trouble and found more than they bargained for. The McCoy brothers will be treated like local heroes who defended themselves against outside bullies. Morrison was already taking notes on a legal pad, his mind working through the logistics of gathering intelligence on targets who lived in unfamiliar territory. Danny, if we're going to do this right, we need to understand the local power structure. Mountain communities protect their own, and the McCoy brothers have probably lived in Beckley County their entire lives. Which is why we're going to take our time, Crawford replied. This isn't going to be some quick hit-and-run operation. We're going to study our targets, identify their weaknesses, and plan something that will hurt them in ways they never recover from. The crew spent the next hour discussing potential approaches to gathering intelligence about the McCoy family. Morrison would use his government connections to acquire official records and employment information. Hayes would reconnaissance the brothers' neighborhoods, workplaces, and regular haunts. Patterson would identify potential local contacts who might be willing to provide information about family routines and personal relationships. But Crawford's planning process was more sophisticated than simple revenge. He understood that successful intimidation required psychological pressure as well as physical threats, and he'd learned that the most effective way to break strong men was to threaten the people they cared about most. I want to know about wives, children, girlfriends, parents, anyone these boys would sacrifice themselves to protect. Crawford told his crew, "Mountain families are tight-knit, and men who fight like the McCoy brothers probably have something worth fighting for." 300 miles away, Samuel McCoy was having similar thoughts about family protection as he sat in his kitchen, drinking coffee that had gone cold while he studied topographical maps of Beckley County. Since the confrontation at Murphy's Tavern, he'd been unable to shake the feeling that Crawford's threat hadn't been empty bravado. Men who carried themselves with that kind of casual arrogance didn't usually accept defeat gracefully. Samuel's wife, Martha, had gone to bed hours earlier, but she'd left him with concerned questions about the tavern incident and worried observations about his brother's safety. After 15 years of marriage to a McCoy man, Martha understood mountain culture well enough to recognize when her husband was preparing for serious trouble. "Samuel," she'd said before retiring, "those men who bothered you boys at Murphy's, they're not going to just let this go, are they?" Samuel had tried to reassure her with optimistic predictions about Crawford's crew, learning their lesson and returning to Virginia with new respect for mountain families. But Martha McCoy possessed the kind of intuitive intelligence that mountain women developed through generations of reading danger signs that their husbands might miss. Now, alone in his kitchen with maps spread across the table, Samuel was forced to admit that his wife's concerns were probably justified. Crawford hadn't acted like someone who would accept humiliation quietly. He'd acted like someone who was already planning his response, calculating his options, and preparing to demonstrate that challenging his authority carried consequences that extended far beyond tavern fights. Samuel's house sat on 20 acres of mountain land that had been in the McCoy family for 3 generations, connected to the main road by a gravel driveway that wound through dense forest for nearly half a mile. The isolation that provided privacy and peace also created potential security vulnerabilities that Samuel was now forced to consider seriously. Marcus lived 5 miles away in a modest home he'd built himself, surrounded by the auto repair shop that served 3 counties and generated enough income to support his wife and 2 young daughters. Jesse had purchased 40 acres on the opposite side of Beckley County, where he'd constructed a log cabin that showcased his carpentry skills and provided space for the workshop where he created custom furniture. Thomas still lived in their father's old house, a bachelor who'd inherited the family homestead along with the responsibility for maintaining the cemetery where 4 generations of McCoys rested. The geographic dispersal that allowed each brother to build independent lives also meant that coordinated protection would be difficult if Crawford's crew decided to escalate their conflict beyond simple confrontation. Samuel understood that mountain families had defended themselves successfully for generations, but they had usually faced threats from people who shared their cultural understanding of how conflicts should be conducted. Crawford and his crew represented something different. Outsiders with urban tactical thinking, modern weapons, and no respect for the informal rules that governed mountain disputes. They might not limit themselves to face-to-face confrontations, fair fights, or conflicts that left families and property undamaged. Samuel's radio crackled with Marcus's voice, interrupting his strategic planning. The 4 brothers had established communication protocols after the tavern incident, checking with each other every few hours to ensure that everyone remained safe and alert for potential problems. Samuel, you still up? Marcus asked, his voice carrying the tension that had affected all four brothers since Saturday night. Still here, Samuel replied. Everything quiet at your place? Quiet as a graveyard, Marcus confirmed. But I've got a feeling in my gut that won't go away. Something about those Virginia boys didn't feel right. They weren't just drunk troublemakers, they were something else. Samuel nodded, though his brother couldn't see the gesture. I've been thinking the same thing. Men like Crawford don't usually back down from humiliation without planning some kind of response. Jesse's voice joined the conversation as he keyed his radio from his cabin workshop. I've been asking around about our new friends from Virginia. Pete Morrison's brother works construction in that area, and he's heard of Danny Crawford. Says he's got a reputation for settling disputes through methods that don't involve courts or lawyers. The information confirmed Samuel's worst suspicions about what they might be facing. Crawford wasn't just another drunk who'd picked the wrong fight. He was apparently a professional who specialized in intimidation and retaliation. The McCoy brothers had defeated him in a fair fight, but they might not get another opportunity for fair confrontation. What kind of reputation? Thomas asked, his young voice carrying the mixture of concern and excitement that worried his older brothers. Jesse's response carried the weight of information that changed everything. The kind that involves people disappearing for a while and coming back with different attitudes about cooperation. Crawford's crew gets hired when other methods of persuasion don't work. Samuel felt something cold settle in his chest as he absorbed the implications of his brother's intelligence. The McCoy family wasn't just dealing with bruised egos and wounded pride. They were potentially facing professional retribution from people who made their living through violence and intimidation. Boys, Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that came from being the eldest son in a family that had faced external threats for generations. I think we need to have a family meeting. Tomorrow morning, early, before anyone goes to work. The brothers agreed to meet at the old mining camp where their grandfather had hidden from government agents during the labor disputes of the 1940s. The location was secluded, defensible, and held generational memories of McCoy men making decisions that protected their family during dangerous times. As Samuel prepared for bed, he found Martha still awake, staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone whose intuition had been confirmed by events she'd hoped wouldn't develop. "It's not over, is it?" she asked softly. Samuel sat on the edge of their bed, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with protecting people you loved from threats you couldn't fully predict. "No," he admitted. "I don't think it's over." Martha reached for his hand, her touch carrying 15 years of shared trust and mutual support through challenges that had tested their marriage and strengthened their partnership. "What are you going to do?" Samuel's answer carried the certainty of someone who'd been raised to believe that family protection was worth any sacrifice, any risk, and any consequence that might result from defending the people who mattered most. "Whatever it takes," he said simply. Outside, the October wind carried the smell of approaching winter through mountain forests that had sheltered the McCoy family for generations. But the same isolation that had provided security for decades might now become a liability if Crawford's crew decided to escalate their conflict beyond public confrontations and fair fights. The stage was set for a test of everything the McCoy brothers believed about family loyalty, mountain justice, and the lengths men would go to protect their dignity and their loved ones. Crawford's crew was planning their revenge with professional, methodical precision, while the McCoy family was preparing to defend traditions and territory that had been protected through generations of determined resistance. The real war was about to begin, and both sides understood that the outcome would determine whether mountain families could still defend themselves against outside threats, or whether modern intimidation tactics had made traditional mountain justice obsolete. The morning would bring planning, preparation, and the beginning of a conflict that would test the limits of what four brothers would do to protect their family's honor and ensure their community's safety. The McCoy name had been built through generations of men who refused to back down from legitimate threats, and Crawford was about to discover whether that tradition still carried weight in modern mountain warfare. The old mining camp sat in a natural bowl between two ridges, hidden from any road and accessible only through trails that had been used by McCoy men for 3 generations. Samuel arrived first, just as dawn light began filtering through the October canopy, carrying coffee and a thermos and the weight of decisions that would either protect his family or destroy it. Marcus appeared 20 minutes later, driving his pickup as far as the old logging trail would allow, before walking the final quarter mile through forests that had sheltered family meetings since their grandfather's time. Jesse emerged from the opposite direction, having approached through the creek bed that provided concealed access from his property. Thomas arrived last, his young face showing the combination of excitement and apprehension that worried his older brothers. The four men gathered around a granite outcrop that had served as their family's council table for 40 years, where their father had made decisions about mine work, land disputes, and government interference. This morning's agenda was more serious than anything the previous generation had faced, but the traditions remained the same. Family business stayed within the family, and McCoy men protected their own regardless of cost. "I've been thinking all night about what Jesse learned," Samuel began, his voice carrying the authority that came from being responsible for family decisions. "If Crawford really is some kind of professional intimidator, we're not dealing with drunk troublemakers anymore. We're dealing with people who make their living through violence." Marcus nodded grimly, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "I drove past my shop 3 times last night, checking for vehicles that didn't belong. Called my wife every hour to make sure she and the girls were safe. This isn't how I want to live." Jesse had brought detailed notes about Crawford's reputation, gathered through his network of contacts in the construction industry. "I talked to 5 different people who've heard of Danny Crawford's operation. Same story from all of them. He gets hired when other methods don't work, and people who cross him end up regretting it." The information painted a picture of opponents who were more dangerous than the McCoy brothers had initially understood. Crawford's crew wasn't just seeking revenge for wounded pride. They were protecting a professional reputation that determined their ability to earn a living through intimidation work. "What kind of regrets are we talking about?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying the mixture of bravado and genuine concern that characterized his approach to most challenges. Jesse consulted his notes, his expression growing darker as he read the details his contacts had provided. Property damage, family harassment, people losing jobs through mysterious circumstances. And that's just what's visible. Word is that Crawford's operation has connections with people who can make bigger problems if the situation requires it. Samuel felt the cold certainty of someone who'd just realized the scope of what his family was facing. The tavern fight had seemed like a simple matter of defending their dignity against drunk bullies, but they'd apparently challenged people whose response might threaten everything the McCoy family had built over generations. "So what are our options?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he'd already reached his own conclusions about what needed to be done. Samuel had spent the sleepless night considering every possible approach to resolving the conflict Crawford's threats had created. "We can try to negotiate some kind of settlement, acknowledge that things got out of hand, and see if they're willing to call it even." Thomas snorted with the disgust of someone who'd been raised to believe that backing down from legitimate threats was worse than dying. "After what they said about us? After they mocked our family in front of the whole community, you want to crawl to Virginia and beg their forgiveness?" "I want to consider every option before we commit to something that might get people killed," Samuel replied firmly. "But you're right that apologizing to men who attacked our dignity probably isn't realistic." Jesse looked up from his notes, his expression carrying the weight of intelligence that eliminated most diplomatic solutions. "Based on what I'm hearing about Crawford's operation, negotiation probably isn't an option anyway. Men like that view any attempt at peaceful resolution as weakness that justifies further pressure." Marcus stood and walked to the edge of the granite outcrop, staring down into the hollow where their grandfather had hidden from government agents during the mine wars. "Papa always said that some fights choose you whether you want them or not. Said the only decision was whether you'd fight on your terms or theirs." The family tradition Marcus referenced had guided McCoy men through generations of conflicts with outside authorities who'd tried to impose control over mountain families that valued independence above safety. But those earlier conflicts had involved opponents who shared basic cultural understanding about how disputes should be conducted. "This is different," Samuel said quietly. "Government agents and coal company enforcers might be dangerous, but they had rules they had to follow, procedures that limited how far they could go. Crawford's crew doesn't seem to have those kinds of constraints." Yes, Thomas kicked at the fallen leaves that carpeted the mining camp, his frustration evident in every movement. "So what? We're supposed to live in fear because 9 bullies from Virginia might come back? Spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders and jumping at shadows?" The question struck at the heart of what it meant to be a McCoy man in mountain culture that prized courage, family loyalty, and the willingness to defend traditional values against external pressure. Running from threats violated everything their father had taught them about maintaining dignity and community respect. "I'm not talking about running," Samuel clarified. "I'm talking about being smart. If we're going to fight, we do it right the first time. And we make sure it ends with results that protect our family permanently." Jesse understood his brother's strategic thinking immediately. "You're talking about making sure Crawford's crew never comes back, never bothers anyone else in our community, and never gets the chance to escalate this conflict beyond what we can handle." Samuel nodded, feeling the weight of crossing a line that would change everything about how his family dealt with external threats. "I'm talking about teaching 9 professionals a lesson they'll remember for the rest of their lives." The brothers spent the next hour developing plans that would either end Crawford's threat permanently or escalate the conflict to levels that might destroy both sides. Samuel's military experience, gained during 2 tours in Vietnam, provided tactical knowledge that mountain fighting techniques could adapt to modern circumstances. Marcus contributed mechanical skills that could transform ordinary vehicles and equipment into tools for psychological warfare. Jesse offered construction expertise that allowed them to modify terrain and create tactical advantages. Thomas provided the kind of reckless courage that dangerous operations sometimes required. But their planning was interrupted by intelligence that changed everything. Thomas's radio crackled with a transmission from his girlfriend, Sarah, who worked as a dispatcher for the county sheriff's department. "Thomas, you need to know that we've had inquiries about your family from someone claiming to be conducting background checks for a construction company. Asked for employment records, property ownership information, family connections. Sheriff Mitchell told them to go through proper legal channels, but it sounds like somebody's gathering information about the McCoy brothers." The transmission confirmed Samuel's worst fears about what Crawford's crew was planning. Professional intimidators would conduct reconnaissance, identify vulnerabilities, and develop detailed intelligence about their targets before launching operations designed to maximize psychological pressure and minimize their own risk. "How recent were these inquiries?" Samuel asked into his radio. "Yesterday afternoon," Sarah replied. "And Thomas, there's something else. We've had reports of unfamiliar vehicles conducting surveillance in areas where your family lives and works. Could be coincidence, but the timing seems suspicious." Marcus grabbed his own radio, his voice tight with the anger that came from realizing his wife and daughters were being watched by people who specialized in threatening families. "What kind of vehicles?" 2 pickup trucks with Virginia plates, seen near Marcus's shop, Jesse's property, and the road leading to Samuel's house. No direct contact, no obvious violations, but enough to make people nervous. The intelligence painted a picture of professional preparation that exceeded anything the McCoy brothers had expected. Crawford's crew wasn't just planning retaliation, they were conducting systematic reconnaissance designed to identify family schedules, security vulnerabilities, and pressure points that could be exploited through threats against loved ones. "This changes everything," Samuel said grimly. "They're not coming back for another fair fight. They're planning something that targets our families." The realization that Crawford's revenge might threaten wives, children, and elderly parents transformed the conflict from a matter of personal dignity into an existential threat to everything the McCoy family valued. Mountain culture had clear rules about involving families in disputes between men, and violating those rules justified responses that would be considered extreme under normal circumstances. Thomas stood up abruptly, his face flushed with the kind of rage that had made him dangerous in the tavern fight. "If those bastards think they can threaten our families, they're about to learn why smart people don't mess with mountain folk who've got nothing left to lose." Jesse was already studying topographical maps he'd brought to the meeting, his carpenter's mind working through the tactical possibilities that mountain terrain provided for people who understood how to use natural advantages against opponents who didn't know the local geography. "If Crawford's crew is conducting surveillance, they're probably planning to hit us when we're isolated and vulnerable," Jesse observed. "But surveillance works both ways. If they're watching us, we can watch them." Marcus smiled grimly, his mechanical expertise suggesting possibilities that urban intimidators might not anticipate. "And if they're using vehicles for transportation and escape, those vehicles represent vulnerabilities that mountain people know how to exploit." Samuel felt the familiar calm that had sustained him through combat operations in Vietnam. the mental state that came from accepting that violence was inevitable and focusing on tactical advantages that could determine survival. Boys, if we're going to do this, we do it completely. No half measures, no leaving loose ends that might come back to hurt our families. The brothers spent another 2 hours developing detailed plans that would transform them from targets into hunters, using their knowledge of local terrain, their network of community contacts, and their willingness to take risks that their opponents might not expect. The operation they designed would either end Crawford's threat permanently or escalate the conflict beyond anything mountain communities had seen since the mine wars. But their preparation was interrupted by urgent radio contact from Dale Morrison, Marcus's war veteran neighbor who'd been monitoring local law enforcement communications through his scanner. "Marcus, you boys need to know that the Virginia crew is back. Sheriff's Department just got a call about suspicious activity at the old Fletcher place, about 3 miles from your shop. Whoever's there has been using it as some kind of base camp. The Fletcher property had been abandoned for 5 years, since Old Man Fletcher died and his children moved to cities where mountain land couldn't support their urban lifestyles. The property included a main house, several outbuildings, and sufficient isolation to serve as a staging area for operations that required privacy and concealment." "How many vehicles?" Samuel asked, his mind already working through tactical implications of Crawford's crew, choosing a base location that close to McCoy family properties. "At least 3, maybe 4. And, Marcus, they're not trying to hide their presence. Lights on in the main house, smoke from the chimney, vehicles parked in plain sight. Either they're confident they've got nothing to fear from local authorities, or they want your family to know they're here." Samuel understood immediately that Crawford was implementing psychological pressure designed to create fear and uncertainty among his targets. Professional intimidators knew that the threat of violence was often more effective than violence itself, and establishing an obvious presence near their enemies' homes was classic intimidation technique. "Dale, any word on how long they've been there?" Jesse asked. "Sarah Fletcher's neighbor called it in this morning, but the vehicles could have been there overnight. Whoever's running this operation waited until they had complete intelligence before establishing their forward base." The information confirmed that Crawford's crew had conducted thorough reconnaissance and developed a sophisticated plan that went far beyond simple retaliation for the tavern fight. They'd chosen their base location strategically, positioned themselves for multiple operational possibilities, and established their presence in ways that maximized psychological pressure on the McCoy family. "Boys," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying the finality of someone making decisions that couldn't be unmade. "It's time to remind Crawford's crew why smart people don't threaten mountain families on their own territory." Thomas checked his hunting rifle, a weapon that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him. Marcus gathered tools and equipment from his truck that could serve tactical purposes in addition to mechanical ones. Jesse studied his maps and notes, identifying routes and positions that would provide maximum advantage for people who knew the terrain intimately. The McCoy brothers were about to transition from targets to hunters, using skills and knowledge that had been passed down through generations of men who'd refused to be intimidated by outside authorities. Crawford's crew had superior numbers, professional experience, and modern equipment, but they were operating in territory controlled by people who understood mountain warfare better than any urban training could teach. "One last thing," Samuel said as his brothers prepared for operations that would either end the threat to their family or escalate the conflict beyond anything they had ever faced. "Whatever happens over the next few days, we're doing this to protect people we love. That means we're smart, we're careful, and we make sure that our families are safer when this is over than they were before it started." The October morning was clear and cold as the McCoy brothers separated to begin hunting 9 men who'd made the fatal mistake of threatening a mountain family that had been defending itself for generations. Crawford's crew possessed professional skills and sophisticated equipment, but they were about to discover that some traditions were older than their expertise, and some opponents were more dangerous than their experience had prepared them to handle. The real war was about to begin, and the hunters were about to become the hunted in mountain terrain that had been swallowing government agents, corporate enforcers, and outside authorities since before the Civil War. The McCoy brothers understood that they were fighting for more than personal dignity. They were defending the fundamental principle that mountain families protected their own through whatever means necessary. Crawford's crew had started this conflict by mocking 4 men for physical differences they couldn't control. They were about to learn that the real difference between them and the McCoy brothers wasn't measured in inches of height, but in generations of accumulated knowledge about survival, family loyalty, and the kind of justice that operated outside legal systems that had never understood mountain culture. The hunt was beginning, and 9 professional intimidators were about to receive an education in mountain warfare that would redefine their understanding of who could be threatened and who was too dangerous to challenge. The pre-dawn darkness of October 28, 1983, settled over Beckley County like a funeral shroud as Samuel McCoy made his final radio check with his brothers. 5 days had passed since Crawford's crew established their base at the old Fletcher place. 5 days of psychological warfare that had pushed the mountain community to its breaking point, and 5 days of careful preparation that would either end the threat to the McCoy family or escalate it beyond anything West Virginia had seen since the mine wars. Marcus, position report. Samuel whispered into his radio from his concealed position, overlooking the Fletcher property's main approach road. Eastridge, 100 yards from the main house. Marcus replied, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone who'd been watching enemy movements for 12 hours. 3 vehicles still on site, lights in the kitchen and front room. Estimated 6 to 8 targets inside. Jesse's voice crackled from his position near the property's rear boundary. South approach secured. 2 sentries posted near the vehicles, rotating every 2 hours. They're maintaining professional security protocols, but they don't know the terrain. Thomas checked in from the creek bed that provided concealed access to the property's eastern flank. Equipment cached and ready. No movement on the back trails. These boys are watching the roads, but they're not thinking like mountain people. Samuel felt the familiar calm that had sustained him through combat operations in Vietnam. The mental clarity that came from accepting that violence was inevitable and focusing on tactical execution that would ensure his family's survival. The McCoy brothers had spent 5 days studying their enemies' routines, identifying weaknesses in their security, and preparing an operation that would demonstrate why smart people didn't threaten mountain families on their own territory. Crawford's crew had made several crucial mistakes during their occupation of the Fletcher property. They'd established their base in a location that provided road access, but limited escape routes through mountain terrain they didn't understand. They'd maintained predictable security routines that could be observed and timed by people who knew how to move through forest without detection. And they'd underestimated the extent of community support the McCoy family could mobilize when mountain traditions were threatened by outside authorities. The brothers weren't operating alone. Dale Morrison had positioned himself near the county road to intercept any attempt at escape or reinforcement. Pete Murphy had closed his tavern for renovations and stationed himself to monitor police communications, ensuring that the McCoy operation wouldn't be interrupted by law enforcement intervention. Even Sheriff Mitchell had found urgent business in the county seat that would keep him unavailable for several hours, demonstrating the kind of selective blindness that mountain communities practiced when local families administered justice that couldn't be handled through legal channels. But the community support extended beyond tactical assistance. Wives and children had been quietly relocated to secure locations where Crawford's crew couldn't threaten them, regardless of how the confrontation at the Fletcher property developed. The mountain network that had protected families during the mine wars had mobilized to ensure that the McCoy brothers could focus on neutralizing threats without worrying about collateral damage to innocent people. Samuel's plan was sophisticated, built on 30 years of understanding how professional intimidators operated and where their confidence became vulnerability. Crawford's crew expected resistance from mountain families who might fight back through traditional methods, shotgun ambushes, property destruction, or direct confrontations that relied on local knowledge of terrain. They weren't prepared for opponents who combined mountain warfare techniques with military tactical thinking and community coordination that eliminated their usual advantages. The operation would unfold in 3 phases designed to strip away Crawford's crew's sense of control, isolate them from support and escape routes, and demonstrate that their professional intimidation techniques were useless against opponents who understood psychological warfare better than any urban training could teach. Phase 1 began at 4:47 a.m. when Jesse triggered the first psychological pressure point. Using techniques he'd learned from his grandfather's stories about mine war resistance, Jesse began systematically disabling the vehicles that represented Crawford's crew's mobility and confidence. Not obvious sabotage that would immediately alert the targets, but subtle modifications that would create mechanical problems at precisely the wrong moments. Sugar and gas tanks would destroy engines when the vehicles were started under stress. Loosened lug nuts would cause tire failures during high-speed escape attempts. Cut brake lines would eliminate stopping capability when Crawford's crew discovered they were trapped. The sabotage was designed to appear like coincidental mechanical failures until the accumulation of problems made it obvious that someone with intimate knowledge of automotive systems was systematically eliminating their escape options. Phase 2 involved what Samuel called environmental modification. Using knowledge passed down through generations of men who'd hidden from government agents, the McCoy brothers began altering the terrain around the Fletcher property in ways that would channel their enemies' movement into predetermined killing zones. Fallen trees created obstacles that forced vehicles onto specific routes where ambushes could be executed with maximum effectiveness. Loosened rocks positioned above narrow passages created potential landslides that could block retreat paths on command. Even the stream beds were modified to prevent escape through terrain that Crawford's crew didn't understand well enough to navigate under pressure. But the real psychological pressure came from what mountain people called the haunting. Beginning at dawn, Crawford's crew began experiencing the sensation of being watched by invisible opponents who seemed to understand their every movement. Equipment disappeared and reappeared in locations that suggested someone had unlimited access to their supposedly secure base. Personal items were moved in ways that created paranoia about infiltration by enemies who could strike at any time. Food and water supplies developed problems that suggested contamination by people who wanted to demonstrate their ability to reach anything Crawford's crew possessed. The psychological pressure intensified throughout the morning as Crawford's crew gradually realized that their professional intimidation techniques were being used against them by opponents who understood the methods better than they did. Every time they established security perimeters, evidence appeared that someone had penetrated their defenses without detection. Every time they planned tactical responses, their communications were somehow compromised in ways that suggested extensive local knowledge of their procedures. By noon, Crawford's crew understood they were facing something beyond their experience. They weren't dealing with frightened mountain families who could be intimidated through superior numbers and aggressive posturing. They were trapped in hostile territory by opponents who possessed every tactical advantage that professional preparation, local knowledge, and community support could provide. "Danny," Billy Hayes said, his voice carrying the strain of someone who'd spent 8 hours jumping at shadows. "These mountain boys are playing games we don't understand. Maybe we should cut our losses and head back to Virginia before this gets any worse." Crawford stood at the Fletcher house's front window, staring out at forests that seemed to be watching him with hostile intelligence. At 38, he'd built his reputation through successful intimidation operations throughout southwestern Virginia, but he'd never encountered opponents who could turn his own techniques against him with such devastating effectiveness. "We can't leave," Crawford replied, though his voice carried none of the confidence that had sustained his crew through their earlier operations. "If word gets out that 4 mountain freaks ran us off after we'd established base operations, our reputation for professional intimidation is finished." But Crawford's determination to salvage his professional standing was about to collide with mountain justice that operated according to rules he'd never learned. At 12:47 p.m., Samuel McCoy's voice echoed through the Fletcher property with the amplified clarity of someone using acoustic techniques that made his location impossible to determine. "Danny Crawford," Samuel announced, his words carrying the authority of 3 generations of mountain men who'd refused to be intimidated by outside authorities. "You and your crew came to our community to threaten families that have lived in these mountains for generations. You mocked our dignity, violated our traditions, and made the mistake of thinking that professional intimidation could overcome mountain justice." The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, created through techniques that mountain families had developed to communicate across ridges without revealing their positions to government agents. Crawford's crew found themselves surrounded by a voice that could reach them anywhere on the property, but provided no target for retaliation. "You have one opportunity to leave our territory and never return," Samuel continued. "Load your vehicles, drive back to Virginia, and find a different line of work that doesn't involve threatening mountain families. This is the only warning you'll receive." Crawford's response revealed the fundamental arrogance that had brought him into conflict with opponents he'd never understood. Instead of recognizing that he was trapped in hostile territory by people who possessed every advantage, he apparently viewed Samuel's warning as a challenge to his professional authority. "Samuel McCoy," Crawford shouted toward the forest, his voice carrying the false bravado of someone trying to project confidence he didn't feel. You and your genetic accident brothers think you can intimidate professionals who've been doing this work since before you learned to walk. But all you've done is delay the inevitable. When we finish with your family, nobody in these mountains will ever challenge outside authority again. The threat was Crawford's final mistake. By explicitly stating his intention to harm the McCoy family, he'd eliminated any possibility of negotiated resolution and justified whatever response mountain justice deemed appropriate. In the culture that had shaped the McCoy brothers, threats against family members weren't just personal insults. They were declarations of war that demanded complete victory or total destruction. Samuel's next transmission carried the finality of someone announcing decisions that couldn't be appealed or reversed. Mr. Crawford, you just told an entire mountain community that you intend to harm families that have been protected by their neighbors for 3 generations. That threat eliminates your option of leaving peacefully. The forest around the Fletcher property suddenly came alive with movement that Crawford's crew could sense but not target. Shapes moved between trees at distances that made accurate shooting impossible, while sounds of preparation echoed from locations that suggested the property was completely surrounded by opponents who'd been planning this confrontation for days. Phase 3, Samuel announced over the radio, his words reaching not just his brothers but the network of community members who'd positioned themselves to ensure that Crawford's crew would never leave Beckley County with the ability to threaten mountain families again. Thomas moved first, using techniques his grandfather had taught him for approaching enemy positions through terrain that provided perfect concealment. At 25, Thomas possessed the combination of reckless courage and tactical intelligence that made him ideal for close-quarters operations that required both skill and willingness to take extraordinary risks. The first member of Crawford's crew died without understanding what had killed him. Steve Patterson was conducting perimeter security near the vehicles when Thomas appeared from the creek bed like smoke, materializing into human form. A single knife thrust severed Patterson's carotid artery, dropping him to the ground before he could raise an alarm that might have warned his companions. Marcus eliminated the second sentry using methods he'd learned from Dale Morrison's Vietnam experience. Billy Hayes was investigating mechanical problems with one of the vehicles when Marcus's approach from the blind spot created by the truck's engine compartment allowed him to deliver a blow to the base of the skull that caused instant unconsciousness, followed quickly by death. Jesse's approach to the main house was slower but more systematic. Using his carpenter's understanding of building construction, he identified structural weaknesses that would allow him to enter the Fletcher house without alerting its occupants to his presence. The back door's hinges had been loosened during the night, permitting silent entry into a kitchen where 2 more members of Crawford's crew were planning tactical responses to threats they couldn't locate or counter. The killing inside the house was swift and efficient. Jesse used techniques that Samuel had taught him during their father's military stories, methods that eliminated enemies without creating noise that might warn other targets. 2 more members of Crawford's crew died at the kitchen table, their final moments spent trying to understand how a mountain carpenter had appeared among them, like death itself. Samuel's assault on the main house came through the front door with the directness of someone who no longer needed to maintain concealment. At 34, Samuel possessed the kind of cold tactical thinking that came from combat experience, combined with absolute certainty that his family's survival justified whatever violence was necessary to eliminate threats. Crawford and the remaining 4 members of his crew found themselves trapped in the Fletcher house's front room, surrounded by enemies who demonstrated their ability to penetrate any defense and eliminate any opposition. The professional intimidators who'd built their reputations through superior numbers and aggressive tactics were now facing opponents who controlled every aspect of the tactical situation. "Danny Crawford?" Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying the calm that came from having already made the necessary decisions. "You threatened my family. You violated my community. You made the mistake of thinking that professional intimidation could overcome mountain justice. Now you understand why smart people don't challenge traditions that have been protecting mountain families for generations." Crawford's final words were lost in the sound of Samuel McCoy's rifle, ending a conflict that had begun with cruel jokes about genetic accidents, and concluded with 9 men learning that some traditions were more dangerous than their professional expertise had prepared them to handle. The cleanup took 3 hours. Crawford's crew and their vehicles disappeared into abandoned mine shafts that had been swallowing government agents and corporate enforcers for over a century. Their base camp at the Fletcher property was restored to its previous condition of neglect, with no evidence remaining that professional intimidators had ever established operations in Beckley County. By evening, the McCoy brothers were back at Murphy's Tavern, drinking beer and accepting congratulations from a community that understood what had been necessary to protect mountain families from outside threats. Sheriff Mitchell returned from the county seat with convenient ignorance of any unusual activity, while Pete Murphy served drinks and told stories that would grow in the telling until they became legend. Samuel, Pete said as he cleaned glasses behind his bar, word's going to spread about what happened to Crawford's crew. Other folks with ideas about intimidating mountain families are going to think twice before they come to Beckley County. Samuel nodded, understanding that the day's violence had protected more than just the McCoy family. By demonstrating that mountain communities could still defend themselves against professional intimidation, they'd sent a message that would resonate throughout Appalachian America for years to come. The McCoy brothers had paid the price that mountain justice sometimes demanded, but they'd ensured that their children would grow up in communities where family traditions were respected, where dignity couldn't be mocked without consequences, and where some things remained more important than personal safety. The mountain had protected its own, and 9 men from Virginia had learned that some communities still believed in justice that operated outside legal systems, answered to traditions older than government authority, and enforced community standards through methods that professional intimidators would never understand until it was too late to use their knowledge. The legend of the McCoy brothers would be told for generations, but the men themselves returned to their normal lives, working in mines and mills, building furniture and fixing cars, raising families and protecting communities that understood the difference between civilization and safety, between law and justice, and between people who could be intimidated and people who were too dangerous to threaten. The cruel height jokes that had started everything were forgotten, but the lesson they'd prompted would be remembered for as long as mountain families needed to protect themselves from outside authorities who didn't understand that some traditions were worth defending with whatever force was necessary. The McCoy name had been honored through violence, but it would be preserved through the simple act of continuing to live according to mountain values that measured men by their character rather than their physical characteristics, by their loyalty rather than their advantages, and by their willingness to defend family traditions that no outside authority had the right to destroy.